opens central diagonals, immediately contesting the pawn structure and preparing for rapid development. Embracing a fianchetto immediately signals a dynamic approach, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially challenge white's central ambitions from the flank. Opening the center creates immediate attacking potential and demands a concrete response from black's fianchetto. The bishop claims its diagonal outpost, a classic fianchetto preparing to pressure the center. Immediately staking a claim in the center, white aims to restrict black's developing pieces and prepare for a kingside assault. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge white's pawn storm on the queenside. Developing the knight to its natural square bolsters, the central pawn chains influence and prepares for kingside castling. Developing the knight to d7 supports the central pawn push and prepares for kingside castling, aiming for a solid setup. Developing the bishop to this square aims to secure the pawn chain's center and prepare for kingside castling, bolstering the king's safety. Boldly challenging the center, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's positional advantage. Unlocking the queenside's potential, white initiates a strategic advance, aiming to constrict black's king's defense and gain territorial advantage. A daring attempt to seize queenside initiative, creating fascinating pawn structure imbalances. Solidifying control of the dark squares and preparing to join the central battle, this bishop repositions for maximum influence. Knight's bold sortie aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially target the fianchettoed bishop. Consolidating the bishop's influence, the pawn structure now presents an interesting locked central tension. Developing the knight to f6 now aims to solidify the center and prepares for eventual kingside pawn expansion, potentially challenging white's central control. Fortifying the central pawn structure, white aims to restrict black's bishop and prepare for a potential kingside advance. Securing the monarch's safety, black now connects the rooks, preparing to contest central influence or potentially launch an attack on the queenside. Preparing to connect the rooks and potentially launch an attack on the kingside is the idea. Shifting the knight to the edge disrupts white's central control and eyes the g3 square, creating tactical possibilities. Nurturing the kingside pawn structure, while developing the knight toward the center prepares for a potential kingside attack. Aggressively challenging the center, black ignites a strategic wildfire hoping to dislodge white's pawn chain and open lines for his pieces. Unleashing the queenside attack, this castling decision clears the path for the rooks and prepares to pressure black's flank. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to pry open the center, aiming to disrupt white's kingside safety and exploit any lingering weaknesses after the castling exchange. Centralizing the knight clears the f3 square for further pawn advances and prepares to challenge black's knight. Exchanging those knights injects immediate tension, potentially opening crucial lines for your king. Reclaiming the bishop sharpens central control and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside. Challenging the pinned bishop, black seeks to untangle its pieces and disrupt white's central control. Pivoting the knight to c3 aims to reinforce the pawn chain and prepare for a kingside attack. Reasserting the knight on its central outpost solidifies black's pawn chain and prepares for potential kingside action. The bishop's foray here aims to disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Shifting the queen towards the kingside opens up possibilities for a rapid attack against white's somewhat exposed monarch, while also preparing potential pawn advances. Sacrificing the bishop clears the d-file for your queen and disrupts black's central pawn structure, potentially opening lines toward their castled king. Restoring material equality, black exchanges a bishop for a knight, simplifying while opening the f-file for potential counterplay. Shielding the monarch from potential central threats and preparing for a safer middle game is the aim. Challenging the central pawn structure, black seeks to activate the bishop and create play on the queenside. Realigning the queen creates avenues for potential central pawn advances, while keeping the king relatively safe from diagonal threats. Unleashing the bishop onto this diagonal immediately challenges white's central control and aims to disrupt their king's safety. Seeking central clarity, white repositions the queen to bolster the kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential exchanges. The queen retreats, allowing the g-pawn to potentially advance, but it creates a slight vulnerability on the kingside should white's knights find their way there. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to pry open lines towards the black monarch. Reuniting the dark-squared bishop with its brethren, this maneuver aims to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for potential pawn advances. Recapturing on e3 prepares to launch a pawn storm on the kingside and contests the central squares. Preparing to challenge the d-file and potentially exploit the open king position. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aims to fracture black's kingside and expose the monarch. This pawn push seeks to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and create attacking chances. Opening the h-file now creates vital attacking avenues towards the enemy king. Unlocking the h-file offers attacking potential, but exposes the king to counterplay. Careful maneuvering is key. Shifting the rook to the h-file creates pressure, potentially opening lines towards black's king and challenging its safety. Reclaiming the contested kingside files is paramount here. The rook's journey to the 7th aims to contest white's mounting pressure. Opening the h-file for attack is a decisive step, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. Securing the king in the center is now a priority, as the file is open. The king's shield is fractured, exposing a vulnerable pathway to the monarch. Relocating the king to the back rank offers no immediate sanctuary and leaves it exposed to the rampant rook. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to pry open lines toward the exposed black king, hoping to capitalize on the recent capture of the rook. Trading bishop for knight disrupts white's pawn structure and opens lines for black's rooks. Reclaiming the central outpost solidifies control and prepares for decisive piece maneuvering. Black recenters the queen, stabilizing the king's flank and preparing for potential pawn advances or a strategic regrouping. Aimed at disrupting black's nascent queenside play, this queen repositioning subtly pressures the b7 pawn while maintaining defensive posture. Reinforcing the pawn chain prevents white's queenside expansion and shores up the pawn structure. Targeting black's vulnerable queenside pawns, this repositioning initiates a subtle squeeze. Securing the rook on its last rank prevents further pawn advances and prepares for a potential defense or counterthrust. Intensifying pressure down the h-file, this rook repositioning aims to exploit black's exposed king and control critical squares. Repositioning the bishop to the corner aims to activate it, though it appears somewhat passive there for now. Opening the file offers a new avenue for your rook, preparing to invade black's territory. A subtle repositioning, eyeing the queenside initiative while keeping the king secure from potential swindles. Centering the queen revitalizes white's attacking chances, preparing to pressure the kingside once more. The black queen retreats, a bit passively, still avoiding commitment on the open files. Securing the monarch on a safer diagonal, now, permits greater freedom for central piece activity. Realigning the king to a more central position, potentially preparing for the endgame's subtle dance. Shadowing the opponent's queen with this allows for potential pawn breakthroughs down the queenside. Regrouping the king to a safer square after the pawn push offers better defensive coverage. The monarch retreats, seeking safety behind a pawn wall, a quiet positional maneuver. Seeking to activate the bishop and prepare for potential queenside counterplay, this maneuver brings the piece into a more dynamic position. A passive repositioning, forfeiting the open file's potential and conceding initiative. Retreating the rook to the 8th rank is a sensible precaution, safeguarding it from further threats on the king's side and preparing to potentially redeploy it for a defensive role. Reshuffling the king offers a subtle improvement in defensive alignment. Shifting the rook defensively to a more active file, anticipating a potential breakthrough or counterplay. King centralization is paramount, preparing for maneuvers that challenge black's passivity. A defensive redirection, seeking to re-establish active piece coordination while white consolidates their kingside pressure. Shifting the king towards the center, white aims to activate it and support potential pawn advances or exchanges in the latter stages of the game. Reinforcing the defensive structure around its king, black aims to regroup and assess the next defensive challenge. Recalibrating for safety, the king abandons its sheltered corner, seeking a more active central presence. Recapturing on f8 concedes the rook's presence on the king's file, a precarious outpost. Initiating a daring repositioning to exploit black's somewhat passive king defense. The rook retreats to a passive square, lacking any immediate purpose and allowing white to consolidate. Solidifying the queenside structure, this move prevents any immediate pawn breaks and prepares for a potential queenside expansion or a repositioning of the queen. A quiet repositioning of the rook, seeking a better outpost on the second rank or perhaps a subtle shuttle to the king's side. Unleashing the rook, this aggressive thrust seeks to penetrate black's beleaguered queenside before their king can find safety. Probing for weaknesses, black seeks to disrupt white's rook on h6 and potentially establish a more active piece placement. The rook retreats, reiterating the pressure on the kingside and awaiting a positional opportunity or a tactical breakthrough. Diverting the rook from its active outpost allows white to solidify their defensive setup. Repositioning the queen to a more active central square, threatening the black king's escape route. This maneuver seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially create counterplay down the c-file. A bold gamble seeking to pry open the black king's shelter through aggression. Retreating the rook seems to signal a temporary lull, a strategic pause before the next engagement. Shifting the queen back allows white to prepare for a potential pawn advance on the queenside or a central regrouping. A desperate attempt to achieve symmetry, yet it achieves little beyond stalemating black's own initiative. Attempting to dislodge the rook from its active outpost, though it seems black's pieces are quite content where they are. Returning the rook to its starting file highlights the positional stalemate. Neither side can generate meaningful pressure. Shifting the rook to the 6th rank aims to restrict black's king's maneuverability and prepare for a decisive breakthrough on the kingside. The rook's retreat to the 4th rank surrenders the central files and allows white to consolidate, potentially leading to a pawn avalanche on the kingside. Aggressively carving open lines for attacking the exposed black king. Retreating the rook offers no relief. The kingside remains fatally exposed to the coming pawn storm. Sharpening the attack by bringing the queen to a more aggressive square near black's weakened king. Shifting the rook to this exposed square allows white to immediately launch a devastating kingside attack. Aimed at unbalancing black's passive defense, this maneuver seeks to disrupt the monolithic pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. Retreating the rook, so it's no longer directly attacked, allows it to escape tactical complications. Controlling that central diagonal offers the opponent breathing room. A bolder advance might have seized initiative. Abandoning the central pressure, black seeks to activate the rook on the open file, potentially creating counterplay. Targeting that exposed king with relentless queen pressure, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares. Repositioning the bishop to defend the pawn chain offers some comfort, but doesn't address the overwhelming pressure on the kingside. Opening the path for the queen to penetrate the black position and exploit potential weaknesses. A bold exchange, opening the g-file for black's rook and potentially activating their queen. Exposing the king further with a forcing check aims to disrupt black's defensive structure. The king's exposed position after the pawn storm now becomes a serious liability. Unleashing a powerful discovered attack, white forces the black king into a precarious open position. Relinquishing the open file's pressure now invites significant counterplay. Unleashing a devastating discovered attack, the rook now swings across to threaten mate while simultaneously defending the knight. Sacrificing the queen here only hastens the inevitable, opening the door for a swift mate. The queen sacrifices herself to promote the pawn, initiating a decisive endgame chase. Sacrificing material to expose the enemy king demonstrates bold, albeit risky, tactical intent. The king now ventures into the fray, hoping to rally the remaining forces amidst the board's disarray.